Right. All right. Thank you so much, Cherise. It's great to be here. I have to say, I'm honored to be in this group. I think as somebody who spent my career trying to walk alongside people as they navigated transitions and made change in their lives and tried to kind of direct their own growth, it's always a wonderful conversation with for me when I get to be amongst other people who are doing that in their careers as well. So I just want to say thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your sort of openness to learning more about my content and what it is that I have to share. I know this is very standard opening a digital session stuff, but it would help me a lot if I knew kind of where everybody was. If I could just ask you quickly to tell me in the chat sort of where you are and what you do. How many of you are coaches? How many of you work on change in different capacities, or, perhaps not at all? If you could just quickly sort of tell me in the chat who you are and where you're sitting at the moment. I am, as you can hear, American, but based in Cape Town. Okay. Namibia. Joburg, Vermont. Okay. DC. Joburg. Great. Cape Town. Okay. Excellent. All right. So it's wonderful also to have a global audience, because part of what I'm going to share today is my own experience, which was that of sort of working across cultures and moving in between different cultures to try to bring about change. Let me quickly share my screen. Okay. So, as Cherie says, I have a book coming out in September called The 10 Permissions, which is obviously what I'm going to be telling you a little bit more about today. But at the root of the 10 Permissions are themes around agency and self-authorship in a disruptive world. And the premise being that we need to give ourselves permission to begin to navigate adult life differently in a world where some of the stories and scripts that used to tell us who we were supposed to be and how we were supposed to behave are unraveling. And I know agency is a very hot word right now. You're hearing it more and more. And I think this is a really good opportunity for us to explore what that means, what this theme of self-authorship means. When I talk about it in the book, when I talk about it in my work, it's that, a lot of our sort of default stories are unraveling. We're moving from a very fixed world where we were sort of told what to do and how to behave and what our careers and lives should look like, into a world where we have to choose. We get to choose how we want our lives to unfold, how we want to shape our identities in the world. So these are some of the themes that I'm exploring in my book, and that I want to explore with you today. Um, Obviously, my premise is that in a world of infinite choice, fluid, rapidly changing context, agency is ever more important in order to drive growth and change. And what I want us to do here is sort of reflect on our role as coaches and change makers in that process of helping people to kind of tap into their own agency in order to drive their own growth. Now, having said that, I want to own right from the beginning that I am not a coach. I'm going to tell you a little bit more of my backstory in just a minute, but I don't come into this session with the expectation that I'm offering you as coaches instruction as such. What I'm doing is offering up my own personal experience as um, a starting point for conversation and individual and group reflection about the role that we play in helping people tap into their own sort of agency and self-authorship. So that's where we're going to start. And then I want to explore the 10 permissions with you. I'll share some of those thoughts with you. The basic idea behind them is sort of giving ourselves permission to create more adaptive lives in a disruptive world. And I'd love to kind of chat to you more about those. And then in the last piece, what I want to do is a little bit of a looking forward. If we are thinking that this is a world in which change and disruption will only accelerate, where we're all sort of sitting looking at the next decade or so, thinking a lot of our current ways of operating are going to shift tremendously. What might coaching look like within that context? How can we help people to thrive within a world of accelerating change? I want to start off by telling you a little bit of my backstory because I think it's quite relevant. It's certainly relevant for me, and I think it gives you a little bit of context here to what I'm sharing. There I am in a variety of different settings, from Mongolia in the bottom right-hand corner to a refugee camp in Sudan in the top right corner to working with health workers in Tanzania in the bottom left-hand corner. I came to this part of the world at a very early age and wanted, in the first instance, to be a part of South Africa's transition to democracy. I was, if I may say, young, quite naive, and ready for just about anything. So at age 23, I got a job with a local aid agency and a local NGO doing capacity building work for NGOs in South Africa. It kind of moved me into the world of facilitation and group facilitation. I learned very much on my feet in that instance. And I started to get involved more and more in sort of community-based leadership, in community-based sort of organizing. And I think as somebody who was new to trying to understand myself as change agent, as change facilitator, as somebody sort of being present with other people as they tried to make change in their lives, I was working on the premise that we as, facilitators would come into situations, provide information, facts, resources, and stimulate change in that way. And to make a long story short, I got a very rough and acute education in the limitations of my own role as a change maker over the course of many years of walking into different situations and finding my own limitations, frankly. And I think that's really the starting point for this sharing this afternoon, is that I come to you as somebody who's learned the most from my failures. And if I can say that the book is really born of my realization that no matter how sort of dire the situation was, no matter how much the need was for people to adapt and change in different situations, I couldn't necessarily make that happen on their behalf. And I'm going to get to in a moment a realization that I had when I was working on HIV/AIDS in Zimbabwe at the height of the AIDS epidemic, where we were throwing everything we had at this large-scale pandemic and not seeing the needle shift at all. And I was at a very young age in charge of that program. And I went to one of my colleagues and said, I realize that we can give people everything in the world. We can give them resources, we can give them facts, we can give them logic. We can't give them permission. And that started for me this idea of what does it take to get somebody to initiate their own change process, to have their own realization that they get to make choices to kind of evolve and adapt in their life. And in some cases, they've got to. I left that period of my work deeply humbled, very burnt out, and very confused about sort of the role that I was going to play as change facilitator moving forward. It got me really thinking about this concept of permission and obviously specifically self-permission. what I came up against oftentimes when I was especially working in, for instance, the context of HIV/AIDS, was that we were asking people to make novel choices. We were asking people, for instance, to be the first in their family to, not inherit their wives, or the last in their family to do bride wealth, because we found that those were drivers of HIV/AIDS. And for us, it made a lot of sense on paper that you would do that in order to stop this pandemic. But the reality was that making those novel choices obviously was incredibly difficult for the people that we were working with. And to my mind, we didn't do enough. We didn't engage enough with this idea of, am I allowed? Are people allowed to make the choices and the changes that we felt that they should make? And obviously, in the cases that I'm describing, the answer was no. There was no social permission for them to do the things that we were telling them to do, which was one of the reasons that our programs were kind of not having the impact that we wanted them to. And so I started to get more and more curious about this theme of self-permission and what it takes for somebody to decide that they are going to make a choice that they've never made before, that they are going to make a choice that will potentially come up against authority, come up against tradition, come up against convention. What does it take to get somebody to do that and to own their own authority to make those choices? I think a lot of my own work in the field of human growth and change coming out of that period of my life was really focused on those themes. And I found myself in my own space going from, working on big kind of aid projects to getting very, very granular in terms of individuals and how to activate their own agency to adapt and grow. I became very curious about whether it was possible to help people kind of move from a place of apathy, if you will, where they were either not feeling like they were able to drive their lives forward in the ways that they want, which I think a lot of us have encountered in different situations. They don't feel they have control over some of the choices that they want to make, to a sense of authority, from following whatever the external cues are, whatever the external um, sort of rewards are for them, to finding something within themselves to sort of self-direct on their own path. And as part of that, not moving necessarily this one from one to the other, but from relying specifically on external rewards to trying to kind of tap into some intrinsic motivation. I ended up writing a book about my experience working in the aid industry, and I did a TED Talk on it as well. And one of the issues for me was that I felt the aid agency relied almost entirely on external rewards in order to try to motivate change. I kind of called it supply side change, rather than getting into what actually is motivating individuals in their own accord to make some of the changes that needed to be made in the circumstances. So yeah, I became interested in sort of what needed to happen and what might happen at an individual level to help people, not move entirely from the left to the right-hand side of this, but perhaps move back and forth and find a little bit more fluidity in their own sense of what they were allowed to do in their lives. I guess you could sum up this part of my sharing with this realization that I had, which was that in my role as an external agent, I couldn't give that permission to people. I couldn't say, it's all right, Cherise, you can fill in the blank. They had to give it to themselves. And so what I have been interested in and what I have been sort of looking for, and I think part of what my book is trying to sort of address right now is um, how do we support and enable people to have that self-permission? How does that sense of authorization to make new choices and to make desired changes come more from within? And that is what's led me to writing the 10 permissions. And And to thinking very much about this, obviously no longer in the context of aid work, but now in the context of a very disruptive world where I think people are having to make those kinds of choices more and more. So let me just pause there for a minute because I've just dumped a little potted history on you of my life. Let me just stop there and see if anything that I've said kind of lands with you, or if you have any questions about what it is that I've just shared in terms of my quick background on myself before we move forward. Nope, all good. What I'd like to do then is to allow for some sharing and some personal reflection in the first instance. I mean, a lot of my story is built out around kind of having hit a wall. And I guess part of what I'm curious to hear from you guys is whether you've hit that wall in your own work, where you are coming up against an unwillingness or an inability on the part of somebody to sort of make the desired changes, the gap, if you will, between the stated and the desired change. Have you tried to help someone? Have you been working with somebody and found in your own context a similar sort of gap between what it is that you're trying to achieve and their own behavior? And how or whether you see permission showing up in your own life or in your own work, or whether these themes sort of resonate with you in your own way. So maybe if I could give you just a couple minutes to think about that.
Jillian, I've got an
Yeah.
odd question. Is it possible to give yourself too much permission?
I think there's probably always a possibility for that I mean, I think depending upon the context, and in the context that I was working in, where people were trying to navigate into a desired way of being, if you will, what I found was that it was usually less rather than more. But I think,
Yeah.
for the most part, the nature of our world and the nature of our place within certain systems usually means that we don't do that. We are more inclined to self-limit than we are to kind of, self-permit to an excessive extent. And in the context that I'm describing, where I think people were trying to navigate tradition, convention, what they thought they were supposed to be versus what the current context was almost requiring them to be. What I found was that it was more likely that they would default to what they'd always done as opposed to what they really wanted to do. But I would certainly believe that it would be possible that somebody could. I haven't encountered that much in my own work or my own world.
Nice, thank you.
Well, thank you for opening that, Julia. I mean, I'd be curious to hear in your own context, you guys coming up against things. Sharon, yeah.
Hello, Jillian. Thank
Hi.
you for being here to talk to us today. What has been coming up for me, and I think the context that you created around AIDS and the cultural role played in AIDS is quite an eye-opener, in that I'm wondering about the interaction between giving permission and competing commitments.
Yeah. Well, so, I'll try and let me share something with you, Sharon, and you can tell me if it sort of responds to what you're raising. I think the story that I told about, realizing that I couldn't give people permission was actually born of work that we were doing with women at the time. We were doing condom training with women, which when I say that and I look back on it, I find kind of ridiculous and sad. The idea being that we weren't men wouldn't listen to that kind of training. You couldn't access men, so you spoke to women because they were more receptive to that sort of message. And we, you know, would do this training with women. They would then go back, and the idea was that they would share it with their partners, obviously, and try and advocate for condom use within their relationship. And obviously, what we found was that, guess what? They were not really in a position to hold those conversations with their partners. Their competing commitment, if I'm hearing you correctly, was in that case a cultural role as a mother, as a wife, as a steward of a certain set of values and traditions, which kind of made me feel, and it's one of the reasons the name of my book was Shame, was because, we were asking people to do things that they were not allowed to do. We were asking them to have conversations that were impossible. So, in that situation, and I talk about this in the book, I think part of what we in many cases need to do is distinguish discomfort from danger. Those women were in danger, and we were actually putting them in further danger by suggesting that they should, do something that they were not allowed to do. So I think, that was also one of the ways that it started to come up for me, which is, how do people believe they're allowed to show up within different relationships within their lives? And what is the scope for them to, um, to play with that, to move with that? In that case, those women had almost none. And in fact, they would come back to us and they would be, a couple of them were beaten because of the conversations that we were asking them to have. So that theme for me of social permission versus self-permission became very resonant. And, and in my mind, a lot of the aid world was going out and attempting to kind of layer in the idea that there were choices to be made when there weren't actually. There was no space for the kinds of choices that we were telling people to make. Now, my book and the context that I'm currently working in is, I think people do have a much wider range of choices. And I think particularly in a very fluid world, that people are finding there's a lot more room for them to sort of play around with who they're supposed to be and how they're allowed to behave. But in that sense, they couldn't. They just couldn't. And so, in retrospect, I felt incredibly ashamed of the fact that we were trying to engineer conversations that people simply weren't allowed to have. I don't know if that responds to what you were raising.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, there's a number of competing commitments there that you were unaware of.
Well, I mean, I think we probably were aware of them. I think in some ways there was an arrogance and a sense that by virtue of simply making resources available and again incentivizing things, that we would create the external circumstances that would, somehow make this feasible. And it never was. But that was one of the reasons that I sort of walked away, because I realized that within that context, I wasn't sure at that stage how to navigate that.
Great.
Chris?
Thank you. Thanks.
Sure. Chris?
Yeah, I'm interested in your first question, in a coaching context, helping somebody change and hitting a wall. And I'm wondering if in coaching, we kind of call that stuckness. And maybe the tools, the tools from a coaching point of view that we would deal with that, I would imagine, might be exploring context. What are the limiting beliefs that the person may have? Can we reframe their narrative and the motivation? Is there a genuine need or will to change? And what are the dangers of change? What replaces the change? What replaces the existing behavior and so on? So I think
Yeah.
your first question talks a lot to what we do as coaches.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we have Julia here who's written quite a lot about stuckness. And I think in some ways, you know, that's what we're in the business of, is helping people get unstuck from whatever the circumstances are. Yeah, and I think I'm interested, that's kind of the spaces that I want to keep exploring here. And just also what I think we'll go to next is in a world where a lot of that context is shifting rapidly. You know, how does that affect our work? Does that affect, you know, the ways in which people feel allowed to become something other than what they are? Jonathan?
Yes, hi.
Hi.
I'm curious how to fit this with something like immunity to change as a model, or whether that's a totally different world for you. Is this just a first layer of, if you can't assume you have permission from those around you, you don't get to the other stuff? Or how do you think of this?
I'm not familiar with the immunity to change model. Do you want to say a little more about that?
Yeah, sure. So if we want to do something, there are lots of things that may be in awareness or out of awareness that will get in the way. And one of those things could be, will I still be accepted by people around me, or will I be safe? But it could also be, is this the sort of person I would want? Is there a part of me that doesn't want to do that, that doesn't want to be that? Does it affect my identity in some way? Am I committed to, you know, so much free choice that I'm going to eat whatever I want, even though I know it's going to get in the way of the healthy body I want? There are lots of different things in addition to
Yeah.
permission from ourselves or
Yeah.
others.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think I'm sort of using it as a language for getting people to engage with a number of those things that you've just described in terms of a sort of way of operating, a way of being, a way of seeing myself, much of which has probably been implicit for me, maybe unexamined. And again, in the context of the book, in which the premise is that because so much of what is external to us is shifting rapidly, and I'm being required in many ways to show up to work or to show up to, you know, different situations. Maybe I need to be more intentional about how I'm giving myself permission to make, as I sort of described there, different choices or adapt more quickly because the context is maybe requiring me to do that more and more. So I see it as sort of making a default way of operating a little bit more explicit and examined, so that you kind of start to look more closely at many of the factors that you've just described and engage with them, and then start wherever possible to, I don't know if interrupt is the best word, but, you know, intentionally decide whether they serve you and suit you as the context around you kind of changes very, very rapidly. So does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And we've only, I think, hit one permission, so maybe it'll become clearer.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
Lauren?
Hi, Jill. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
I have a big doggy racket going on, so excuse that. So I actually thank you for everything that you said just now, Jill. There were a few things that I wrote down that I think really kind of speak to some of the things that I have on my mind, and I'm thinking about them, but I'm not quite sure how to answer them. A couple of them are, is there actually a space for people to make a choice? So I do a lot of work with business clients, corporate clients, and I'm seeing more and more with people and in teams, there's a lot of, I suppose, yearning to be able to take more action and have more agency and more authority. And so a lot of the work that I'm engaged in is to help kind of build the capacity and the skills to do that. And yeah, that question, how am I engineering conversations that people are not actually allowed to have? That's such a that's such a kind of struck me in my sternum, because it's a big question that I've been asking myself as a coach and a facilitator, is how this work is fantastic and exquisite in that contained space, and then the questions and the conversations and the type of engagement that we practice and we build there is not allowed. So there isn't that permission, there is that social permission, and the self permission is not, it's not there at all. So for me, that's a contradiction and a conundrum in doing this work with people. It's, so I'll just drop that in.
Yeah. Well, I will say that I went on to do work with organizations. I left, I had just turned 30. I left the world of aid work and started the world of organizational change and corporate change. And I will say that the dynamics, as you've just described, were only slightly different, in that, you would be brought in by somebody who wanted an outcome, who wanted something to shift. And yet you'd then sit in a room and see people wondering, am I really allowed to do what they say they want me to do? And, Jonathan, as you sort of described, the multiple layers of trying to work out for yourself what the other side of that looks like, and whether or not you're able to show up to that. So, yeah, I mean, it kind of, for me, working in this consulting form and coming into spaces where, that feeling of wanting to get more explicit about this concept of rules, wanting to get more explicit about this concept of, what the unspoken rules of operating are within different environments, so that we are able to then, decide, is this how we're working? Is it not? And I think in some cases you have the social permission, the team, the group has decided, yes, it's okay, but you have no lived experience in giving yourself permission to step into that space. In other cases, people are anxious for change and wanting to give it to themselves, but they're afraid because there are a variety of potential outcomes to moving into sort of a new space. So yeah, I think for me, so much of what I always encountered was everything that wasn't said, and everything that was implicit in terms of the unspoken rules of engagement around people's, beliefs of how they were accepted and what was approved of. So wanting to make that more explicit and something we could deal with. Anybody else? Okay, let's carry on a bit. Because what I did want to do is give you some time without me around. I think I'd love for you guys to, because trust me, I'm also here to kind of learn from you, is to dig in a little bit to this theme of agency and permission. And, in your own practice and in your own experience, sort of one of the things that I talk about in the book is what I describe as the permissions paradigm of raising young people to seek permission, but not actually supporting young adults and supporting adults to explicitly give it to themselves, to begin to engage far more intentionally with their own choice making around their own growth and change. And, to me, it's not that people are consciously waiting for somebody to say, yes, you may, but they're also hesitant and uncertain in terms of testing the ground for what they're allowed to do. So I'd love to hear more from you guys about your own experiences of seeing clients kind of in that space of wondering what they are going to authorize themselves to do, or how they do that, and the ways that you have, whether intentionally or not, through the course of what you've learned to do or been trained to do, or just through your own lived experience, learn to kind of, what I describe here is ignite agency, or, help people tap into that a little bit more deeply. I think Charisse is going to break you into groups so that you can have a chat about this. I'd love to hear from you guys in your own experience of the ways that you get people to tap into their own agency. Charisse, are you going to break people up for us?
Yes, Jill, I'm pairing everyone up, and there's one group of 3. And are we giving 10 minutes, Jill?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
Fantastic. We'll see you back here, and I'll give you a halfway mark when you're halfway. The rooms are opening.
Well, Jonathan and I and Charisse had a nice little chat there. Is there anything either in the group or on the chat that came up for any of you that was something useful, interesting, sparky for you?
Yeah. I mean, if you other two don't mind me having a go. Thanks, Lauren and Sharon. We were just noticing with great interest how this need for permission goes right to the top. We were sharing examples where we were working with very senior teams who never asked for what they wanted, either in one-on-one sessions or in a group session, but who then went later and complained and said, why didn't you do blah, blah, blah? And the answer was, why didn't you ask for it?
Yeah, I want to come back to that in a minute, Julia, with my first permission, which is be willful, because I think the the expression and the acting on will is like such a foundational thing here for us to engage within ourselves. Like that for me, I had to start there because I think so many of us have to, again, reflect on our relationship with our own desires as a starting point for all this, whether those are small, lowercase d, or capital D. I didn't mean to cut you off there. Did you have more to say about that?
No, perfect.
Anybody else? James?
Well, I work in the care sector, and one of my biggest challenges is to give people permission to do less. So people who try and show up as good carers often disable people, and I have to constantly say, let people make mistakes. It's with people with disabilities. Let them struggle through something. Don't rush in and support them. And it's a massive unlearning that people have to do. And once they get permission, they can become absolutely brilliant carers. But especially when they're worried for their jobs and they're trying to show up as being what they think to be excellent carers, they end up disabling people. So yeah, it's interesting that you've made me think of the word permission, because I didn't really think of the word permission, but it's a very strong word that's very useful for me to bring back and to say you've got permission. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you for that. That's such an interesting example, I think, of, the people we think we're supposed to be. And when, something that Jonathan and I were talking about is that so much of that nobody's written that down. Nobody's told you. There's an acting and a performing in order to meet, a set of expectations that may or may not be real. And in the case that you're describing, may or may not be useful. And so some of what this nudge to is to kind of, I talk a lot about intentional and explicit, even if only with yourself, of, intentionally deciding, is this how I'm expected to behave? Is this what the external set of expectations is that I'm trying to meet? Or have I created that for myself? what is good look like, whether in a professional or a personal role. And again, I think for many people, they've spent so much time looking outwards to be told how to behave or what the standard is, that they are, I kind of describe it as not having a lot of muscle to do that themselves, to make their own choices and their own decisions. And the word permission, I should tell you, I took 5 years to write this book, and the word permission was buried underneath a whole lot of other stuff. And I kind of started talking to people about it. And a funny thing happened when I started to use that word more, was that I realized it was incredibly visceral. It was something that I think touched on people in a super intuitive way of, it's a feeling as much as a thought of, how interesting in terms of what I think I'm allowed to do, and the associations with it. So I kind of started to play around with it even more as something that felt like an entree into a broader set of conversations around, our own choices and our own behaviors. But I find it's something that no matter, where you are in your life or against different cultures, people understand the concept at a sort of gut level, what it looks like and what it feels like to feel permitted and to not, which I think is the feeling that a lot of us carry around. I want to move on and talk about the 10 permissions now that we've explored the theme of permission very broadly, because, in many ways, that's what we're here for. I describe my book as a playbook for navigating adult life in the chaos of the 21st century. And as I've alluded to already, but I'll just say again, the idea is, and you see the subtitle is Redefining the Rules, that the rules are being rewritten in front of us. So many of the norms of how we expected to navigate our adult lives are shifting. And things like linear, seamless, accumulative career paths no longer exist. The idea of institutional advancement as, the primary strategy for achieving success and security in your life is currently unraveling around us as hierarchies are flattened, as layoffs become more common. But across a number of different parts of, how we live, in my conversation with James, we were talking about things like parenting, where the rules for what used to be right are now completely up for grabs. And there are 1,000 different ways of doing things, 1,000 different opinions, usually very strong ones about what's right, what's wrong. And so within that, the pressure on the individual to make their own choices is growing ever stronger. And the pressure on the individual to rely ever more on their own authority to make those choices amongst, a lot of contested opinions is ever greater. And I think we see that in sort of the sense of overwhelm that people feel, the anxiety about whether they're doing it right. As I've started to talk about this content with people, especially, people at different stages of their adult lives, I think what I hear so much from people is, somehow it's like, I'm not where I'm supposed to be. Life doesn't look exactly like I thought it would. I don't have what I thought I would at this stage. I don't, I haven't reached the place in my life that my mental model for where I'm supposed to be told me I would be. So the premise of the book is that amidst these kinds of unraveling norms and accelerating change, we need to be super intentional about the permissions that we give ourselves to navigate our lives. So these are the 10. Yes.
Sorry, are you sharing slides? Because I just wanted to check. We don't see
Oh,
them.
sorry. Okay. Well, I need to fix that then.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. Where are we? Yep. Is that better?
See them. Thank you.
Sorry, now I'm from the beginning. Let me move right on here. There we are. So these are the 10 permissions, and I've referenced a few of them already. And they are born both of the experience that I referenced in my introduction, to sort of being present to, witnessing, and attempting to assist people through really profound transitions in their lives, and making changes in their lives because they either wanted to or because they had to. They're also born of this moment and sort of cheeky attempts to flip the script on what it is that people think they're supposed to be. I sort of describe them as provocations to a lot of our should stories about the ways that we should behave as adults, and what we think that our lives should look like. So I'm going to go through these. I won't go into lots of detail on any of them, but I'll give you an overview of them, and then we can talk about them a little more. And Julia already kicked us off on this one. The idea here is that, most of us from an early age have been conditioned to suppress our want, and, in using my language, outsource our wants to people around us, to our family, to our community, in the case of the examples that I gave, to our organization, perhaps in the example that Julia gave, that there's something inherently dangerous about expressing desire, maybe even tapping into it. And that made sense because, we were living in a world, I think, where compliance rewarded us, where we were being prepared to fit into external roles in, systems, be they, corporates or factories or wherever our places of work were. We filled into ready-made roles, and those roles shaped our understanding of who we were supposed to be and how we were supposed to behave. As those external roles unravel, as we are being allowed to and forced to kind of define a little bit more of our own paths, the invitation to be willful, the permission to lean more into your own wants, becomes ever more critical. I think this is a world that is so fluid that you are able to act on and create things that you want. I think you are being required to articulate what you want, perhaps more than ever. And I think as we move forward into ever more disruptive times, both at work and in the world, the more that we are able to communicate, negotiate, co-create, and collaborate around our shared wants, the more we might be able to kind of engage with the world in the way that I think will allow us to bring our most value add to it. So obviously, as with all of these, and I say this in the book, the idea here is not to be demanding it and greedy, because that's what our association is with being willful. It is to figure out how to bring our wants into the world, find out which ones of them are feasible, which ones we are able to act on, which ones we can find other people to kind of work with us on. We can talk about that more. Go astray. So again, a lot of the conditioning is around very linear paths, the idea that we would move seamlessly, that our identities would be far more fixed than they are now. And as we know, the lived experience of this is growing sort of rarer and rarer. So the idea here is to embed change into your life rather than waiting to make it happen, or waiting for it to happen to you, I should say. So I think we've always been risk averse and change averse, again, understandably so, because there was reward attached to loyalty and longevity within certain situations. As those rewards decrease, as people realize that there is no benefit for them in sort of staying in their lane, if you will, the invitation here is to permit yourselves to make change more readily to embed change and to expect that your life will involve change, and that doesn't make it problematic. Because what I hear from a lot of young people in particular is that they still are very imprinted with the idea that one thing is going to lead to another, and that that's what good looks like. But when they allow themselves to accept the fact that they're going to be twists and turns, that they might get knocked off their path, and that's okay, because within those turns is most of your best learning. It's when you grow the most. It's when you develop a lot of the kind of resilience and grit, if you will, to keep going, that you normalize, if you will, this idea that my life isn't going to be one seamless escalator up to the top. It's going to look a lot different than my parents did. Take it outside is an urging, if you will, to kind of remain curious, expansive, and receptive. So what you will see is that a lot of these are about saying, okay, you need to have an approach to creating a life path for yourself that is relatively adaptive, that avoids you getting fixed in one place, and then when change happens to you, you are ill-equipped to deal with it. So it's kind of saying, make sure that you're constantly getting outside of whatever sort of bubble you might be in. That if the old norm was head down, as I said, stay in your lane, stick to what you know, now you need to be looking around, scanning your environment, dot connecting, and really making sure that you are constantly taking yourself into places where you can be teachable, learnable, is that a word? Teachable, really ready and able to learn and take in the new, because that's the reality of life today, that you are being asked to take in, absorb, respond, and adapt to new factors all the time. Experiment. So I think we kind of saw life as an equation before. I describe it as the if-then world, which was a world of requirements and guarantees. So if I go to university, then I will have a job. If I get a degree in coding, then I will be secure for the rest of my life. And the way I talk about it in the book is that we're moving into a kind of what-if world. So there are no guarantees anymore. And the equations that we thought granted us certainty don't do that any longer. So we have to be much more willing and able to try small things, to not have, place 3 big bets on ourselves and our whole lives, which is, where we'll go to school, who we'll marry, and what job we'll get, but to remain open to trying new things, lower consequence, potentially higher upside experiments. And, adults were never supposed to experiment before. We only acted when we knew what the outcome was going to be. We were very much act in the face of predictable outcomes. And the idea here is that we need to be prepared to and open to acting without the certainty of the outcome already in place. Feel your way. A complex and uncertain world is, I think, calling us to dive ever deeper into our bodies and to use our integrated intelligence in a way that we never necessarily thought we had to before, and we certainly weren't encouraged to. I think we saw most of our choices as being cognitive, intellectual, rational. And I think now, in a state where we don't necessarily know what the future looks like, when we're uncertain of what, the next steps in our path might look like, we're going to need to allow ourselves to tap into instinct, to intuition, to kind of listen in rather than looking around all the time, and to look at sort of the ways that we use that integrated intelligence as a guide and a compass in finding our way forward. Forget about the future. I always get a lot of questions on this one, especially as somebody who spent most of my career working on strategy stuff and long-term visions and this and that. And obviously, this is a little bit playful, the idea being that when the future is unbelievably unpredictable, when the idea of a 5-year plan for most people sounds impossible, unfeasible, we need to not expect that we can work deductively, that we have a fixed destination and we decide how we're going to get there from here, that we might need to work more inductively, that we might need to have sort of a big intention. I call it sort of a direction rather than a destination mindset. So you might not be able to know exactly where you want to be in 5 years' time. You'll have a big kind of direction, and then you'll start to work inductively in finding your way forward. This one, again, is really important for me for young people, a lot of whom I talk to who feel inadequate, ashamed because they don't have the big 5-year plan. They don't have the grand sense of clarity about exactly where their life is leading. And that's what they think, ambitious and capable adults are all supposed to have. And when you say, it's okay, I don't think any of us knows what 5 years from now looks like. So have a general sense and then start going out, be present and discovering. They find it incredibly liberating that they can find their way. And that relates very much to this one, which is think small. I'm playing a little bit here with the kind of 20th century bigger is better and go big or go home, or all of that, where again, I talk to people now who are like, I don't have the big vision. I don't know what the big plan is. It's hard for me to wrap my head around that. And remembering that this is about sort of permission to allow yourself again to potentially work in shorter time frames, to discover as you go, to and what I talk about in the book is to know that maybe you don't know what your big plan is. That doesn't mean that you're not ambitious. It means that you are being as responsive as you can be to changing circumstances. So I call it a sort of small steps, find your way approach to moving forward in your life. Travel light. Yeah, I think a volatile world is giving a lot of people pause for thinking about what they need and want in order to have security in their lives and create security in their lives. And I think for most people, the imperative to gradually and seamlessly accumulate more and more is an incredible barrier to them acting on some of their deeper desires. They don't feel they're able to do what they want because it won't reward them financially in the way that they think they should. So some of this is saying, allow yourself to optimize for adaptability rather than for accumulation. That maybe what your priority is now is to see yourself moving through different phases of your life where you might want to take more risks. You might want to put things down rather than picking more things up. But that the model for you to think about how you thrive in a very disruptive world doesn't have to be more, more, more. It can be, what can I carry right now? How do I continue to move forward with a degree of flexibility and receptivity to whatever changes that I need or want to make in my life? Look for trouble, always a goodie. I think a lot of life has been sort of corporatized, and a lot of people have avoided doing things that they thought would be too hard, would get them into trouble. They've avoided the challenging problems. They've avoided the hard conversations. And some of what I'm saying in the book is look for trouble, not for a fight, but for a teacher, because this is a world where I think we need to be willing to go out and learn from some of the difficult things that we're facing right now, to not shy away from things that we think might be troubling, that might challenge us, that might make us uncomfortable, that might make us feel incapable even. That this is a time for us to, figure out what matters to us. And coming back again to conversations with young people, I hear often, nobody asks me what matters to me. Nobody asks me what I care about. They're just interested in whether I'm going to get a good job. And I think there's a lot of young people right now who are looking for a sense of meaning in some of what they do and don't necessarily feel allowed to have those conversations as they come into adulthood, because that's not what success has traditionally looked like. So it's sort of saying maybe in this world right now, we need more people who will allow themselves to go and do some of the harder things. And last but not least, make believe. Make things you believe in and believe you can make things. I think this is, again, as we move away more and more from filling fixed roles within institutional systems towards having to be more creative in our mindset as to what our work will look like, as to what our contribution will look like in the world. A lot of us have spent our lives not feeling like we could create, that was only for a few people and the rest of us just sort of filled our jobs. And I think here it's sort of saying, believe and allow yourself to imagine that you could make things, that you could create things, that you could be a part of, not necessarily capital I innovation, but helping to solve problems, helping to look at old problems through a fresh lens and to go out into the world with that mindset. Because I think it is a world that will ever more reward people who approach their own identities and their own work through a creative lens. And those are the 10 permissions. I wanted you guys to talk about those, but let me perhaps stop for a moment. And again, I've just dumped a huge amount on you. Any immediate kind of, I don't get that, what are you talking about questions for me based on what you just heard, or I want to know more. I'm curious to know more from you. Jonathan.
Yeah. So one of the questions I'm having is, to what degree this applies to people we might be more, at least some of us might be more likely to work with, who have means, who have a certain amount of power and privilege, and whether this sounds any different or should sound any different for people who have less power and agency. As somebody who's worked in that world, what do you think?
Yeah. That question comes up a lot because I think a lot of us see the ability to create our own path as a luxury, and I think it has been, and yet actually most of the people that I've worked with, somebody asked me that very question, and I said, the most adaptable people I've ever met are street vendors on the streets of Johannesburg who probably do a lot of these things quite intuitively because they are finding their way all the time through a world that is changing so rapidly around them that they don't have the luxury of security as a concept. So a lot of it is, to me, not about, I think part of the luxury that we've had is what I described as the if then thing, that if I could just do certain things, then I could kind of coast. And what this is saying is, I don't think that's an option anymore. You're going to have to make a lot of choices about how you're going to find your way through your life. And to me, that applies. Obviously, those conversations and those choices with yourself are going to look totally different whether you're sitting, on the 15th floor of a building in New York City versus on a side of the road in Cape Town. But you will be having conversations about what's my next step and what am I going to do, and how you find your way through disruption, I think, is a mindset that actually is far more intuitive for people who've never had security in their whole lives. So, I see it as almost a leveling of a playing field in which you can't buy your way to assuming that everything's fine if you just do a few things. You're going to have to be a little bit more on your toes to keep positioning and repositioning yourself in a world that's changing rapidly around you. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Thank you. No, that's interesting. Thanks.
Sharon?
Yes, I mean, it's really an observation that I have, and it is that in these 10 permissions, I see everything that was the opposite in the generation that I have grown up in. So I guess the challenge sits with my children and how they parent, because there is that competing commitment, and I've used that twice, but it's actually Jonathan referred to the immunity to change. It's part of the immunity to change process. There is that of me standing and watching how my children are parenting, and them having me watch them and know that in some way they are competing, or they're going exactly the opposite to the way they were parented. So I think it's not an easy story, this. And I consider myself someone who's stayed with the world and tech savvy and all of these things because I've had to, but there are many who haven't. And so I see some competing commitments between generations here, because you're speaking exactly to my grandchildren and the way they live their life.
Yeah, Sharon, thank you so much for that. I mean, I'm a parent to a 17-year-old and a 14-year-old, and I feel like, so I'm probably somewhere in between them and you, I think, maybe, I don't know. And I do feel like my generation was the sort of turning point towards a world in which, my language around requirements and guarantees started to unravel a little bit. And the millennials were the ones who started to raise their hands, the first 21st century generation, and go, hey, wait a second, I'm playing by the rules, but I'm not getting rewarded. But when I try and change the rules, you tell me I'm woke and entitled. So I'm not sure what to do about that. And, now we see in the workplace, for instance, where there are 5 different generations working side by side, there is a lot of very different takes on, to use my language, what's allowed and what's good. And that's
Exactly.
why, again, it's kind of having an explicit conversation around that, because we can't assume that the norms that, have very much shaped our understanding of the world for the late 20th century into now necessarily still, and I'm using my language, reward people in the same way. And I think that that's what they're finding is, if I continue to follow that model, I'm not getting the same things that my grandparents did or even my parents did. So I need to figure something out that's different. And this is sort of saying, okay, because we're not going back to that. We're not going back to, 1985 when I grew up. And so I need to kind of look at how this world is going to support and reward and enable them to thrive over time. And you're absolutely right. It's very different and it's very challenging. Ella, you had your hand up.
I did, and I can speak now if you'd like.
Please do.
I just felt really touched by what Sharon has surfaced, and I felt really excited by what you are speaking about, Jill. I'm so in that space, this space of like alchemical creativity and doing something that is different and really alkalizing something new for the world, because what we've been doing is not working. We're kind of on a downhill trajectory, and it's very scary. I work in the trauma-informed space, and it's very scary how the world is responding and reacting. And so this already energetically, this sits perfectly. This list of things is like excites me, and it's already what I've been working on. And I'm like, yes, it can be used in so many different ways, and it can make a difference. So not taking away anything from how we have processed in the past, but really realizing that as we step into this new way of being with our Gen Zs and Gen Alphas, it's a completely different way of making meaningful work accessible, of making healing accessible.
Oh, thank you, Ella. Yeah, I think that means a lot. And that is, I should say, as a mom to 2 teenage sons, as somebody who feels like, I'm 54 and I have a certain period of my life left to try and contribute something. I think we need to acknowledge the fact that these young people are entering into a very different world. And we do know that. It's everywhere you look around. And it did start with the millennials who started to complain about adulting, who started to feel that they weren't getting ahead, who started to say, but wait a second. And so, for me, I think we know that the old way of operating is no longer supporting people to create the lives that will either be secure or satisfying. So they weren't necessarily satisfying before, but they were secure. And now they're not either. So can we step with confidence and with clarity and courage into a space of saying, okay, we need to think differently about how we do this, given this set of circumstances, to embrace it and do it, not hesitantly, not quiet quitting or, quiet cratering was the last thing I heard. Not people slowly going, wait a second, I'm not coping, but okay, how do I create something that actually works for me? Lauren?
Thanks, Jill. I think I also just have something on my mind, a question about how do we do this collectively or in community, right? Because you're giving yourself permission and I'm giving myself permission. And, how do our sets of permissions clash? So how do we navigate that collective space as well?
Yeah, I mean, obviously hugely important. The book is obviously written for individuals because I do think individuals are under a tremendous amount of pressure to figure this stuff out all on their own. And again, every single time that I talk with a group of university students or high school students, they feel this unbelievable pressure to figure out a way forward when they absolutely know that the prescriptions that worked for their parents don't work for them, but they don't have an alternative. They don't know what an alternative to that would be. So I think one of the things that I am doing is creating a community. I currently have about 100 people in my community, all of whom are kind of intentionally, navigating some transition in their lives. And it's everybody. And the way I describe it is if you're 15, 25, or 55, you're probably looking at the road in front of you and going, okay, this is got some uncharted territory in it. How do I do this? And how do I do this in a way that I maybe don't feel alone and overwhelmed? Maybe we can share with each other around how we do this together. So I do think community is critical, and I think everything we hear about the loneliness epidemic and the way that particularly young people are going into themselves because it feels too daunting and because they don't know, they don't have a story to latch onto that they trust is going to result in the outcomes that they want. So I think particularly for younger people, creating communities where they can come together and, not only find their own way, but help to create new ways together is critically important.
I would like to add in there, Jillian, just in terms of the community aspect of, working with the 10 permissions and seeing how people give themselves permission. So you see the intention behind it is incredibly encouraging. And then it's like, hey, wait a minute, I can give myself permission too. What do I need permission for? So it's a conscious, space of, it's intentional and you can see that. And I find that is a useful space to be in. And then it almost feels like permission is being built and it becomes more surfaced rather than just something that's below the surface and going, I'm so scared of doing this, or I don't want to do this, and now I'm uncomfortable again. And it's like, well, I can give myself permission to lean in more. Okay, let's do that. Such an interesting change of energy.
Yeah, thanks, Cherise. I mean, trust me, it's been interesting for me too. I mean, I'm my own living experiment here with how people act and react when they are with other people who are, again, looking at their default way of operating or their story of who they think they're supposed to be and how they think they're supposed to behave and going, okay, is there scope here for me to make small changes? And a lot of the book is about micro changes. A lot of this is, having worked in an industry of you only change when there was a big problem and then you launch some sort of huge initiative to try and fix the problem. I'm really trying to move out of, periodic fixing to routine adaptation, to small, constant adaptations as opposed to, periodic corrections. Because once you get to that point where it's a correction phase, every single one of us knows how difficult that is. So that speaks a little bit to the next part of the conversation around creating a slightly more sort of fluid and adaptive sense of self, where maybe in a context where things are changing rapidly, we do become a little bit more front-footed about making shifts before they become stuckedness. Maybe we have a greater sense of control over our story when the external stories are so much more fluid. I know there's only a few of us left, but Cherise, maybe we could just, for just a few minutes, have time to talk to each other, because I do think it's super important that you guys get to talk to each other about, I mean, we've talked a little bit about the first question already, but I would be curious if, you see any of these kinds of themes, obviously not necessarily using, my language, but these ideas of sort of finding your way through a rapidly changing world and needing to adapt the way that you operate. Do you see any of these showing up for your clients or in your conversations? I would love to hear more. Cherise, maybe if we just, break everybody up into pairs.
Okay, let's just do that. Pairs. Okay, great. And you'll have what, 10 minutes?
That'd be great.
All right, there we go. I think someone's just left. Oh no, here they are.
See?
Oh,
Oh,
Everyone's back. Welcome.
welcome back. We have about 15 minutes left here. I would love to hear any interesting nuggets from your conversations, if there were any. Again, invitation to either share them in the group, or if you just feel like typing something out, that's fine too. Anybody like to share something?
I'll go. I can't find the hand on my screen, so
That's okay.
if thanks, Rick. It's for a very interesting conversation. And I think we got quite animated towards the end when I asked the question, how do we we're in relationship with one another, and we both doing permissioning, and we both permissioning willful, and our willful is different. How do we do that together without annihilating one another? Or you know what I mean? And Rick has brought up the point around, well, it's easy there's an easy answer if we conform, if we're in the space of conforming, but that's not really, is that the point? So anyway, more questions than answers, which is
Yeah. I mean,
Rick,
obviously,
Bethany, is there anything else? I'm sure there is.
Yes, no, I mean, the bigger context is just that collective decision making and action is probably one of the single biggest problems that civilization has had to deal with forever. And to conform is one mechanism to deal with that.
right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're already seeing a greater space for will and want to be expressed as consumers, certainly. I mean, we curate everything in our lives now. The question is, can we curate other things? Can we bring our wants to other parts of our lives, and maybe within that space become better communicators and negotiators, become better compromisers? Because one of the silly examples I give is, you know, when you say to somebody, well, what do you want for lunch? And they say, I don't know, what do you want? The idea that I would say, I want pizza, and you say, I want sushi, and then we go, okay, well, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to get your thing today and my thing? You know, I think to some extent, the problems that we faced up until now, and the problems that I came up against throughout most of my life, was more of a result of suppressed want and the resentment and lack of sort of contribution that comes with that, particularly obviously as you get older in life. So I think we would learn a lot from people who were more openly sharing their will, acting on their will, and learning, as you say, Rick, is how do we collaborate and co-create on a micro level to a macro level. I think one of the things I talk about is to kind of start small, low consequence, and potentially high pleasure, so that it can be something that doesn't feel contentious. And maybe start with yourself and before moving out to other people. A lot of people can't even engage with their own wants in ways that have nothing to do with other people. So I think that, you know, there's a lot of scope for us to kind of become a little bit more aligned with the things that we have to share, the things that we want to do. And of course, some of that will involve heading out into the world and finding out that there's not a great reception to it. But that's feedback that you can then work with. Jonathan.
Yeah, one of the things James and I were talking about was speculating about the ways in which people learn not to give themselves permission. And, you know, one possible distinction is it's actively taught that it's dangerous to ask, or potentially even to be aware of what we want.
Yes.
Because it's just going to be too disappointing or dangerous.
Right.
And then sometimes it's a lack of positive evidence. It's
Yes.
not, I was beaten or I was ignored. It's just, I've never done it. And
Right.
so how would I know if it's safe or not?
Right. Yeah. It's really interesting. And I find it very interesting to begin to talk to people about that. You know, think about, you know, growing up or the times in your life when you, as you say, there was either active prohibition to engaging with your wants, or there was simply sort of a vacuum of encouragement. And I think the reality is, I'm speculating here, but for a lot of us, it's the vacuum. It's just it becomes easier. It becomes, again, we're rewarded for appearing to be obliging or familiar. And so we learn that that's sort of a way of operating that we think is going to serve us. And again, part of the backdrop for this conversation is that it might not reward you as an adult in the same way that it once did. If you are facing going out into a world of work where you need to maybe advocate for yourself, where maybe more and more of us will be working as freelancers or in fractional roles, where we'll be negotiating contracts in different ways, or we'll be moving in and out of different situations where we're going to have to show up differently to different people. You know, we might need to think again about what we are carrying with us as a set of either, you know, conscious or unconscious ways of operating that might not serve us anymore. We've got 10 minutes, and I think that's kind of a good entree to the next piece, which we're not going to spend too much time around because we've had lots of good conversation. So let's I think, I've talked a lot about this, but it's sort of the reality of living in a more fluid world and how that shapes our understanding. And I think, in many ways, what you've just said, Jonathan, is of interest in terms of what will the world moving forward either actively prohibit or enable or require, because it is a very different operating mode that we are in right now. So will future generations start to perceive themselves differently? That was kind of where I wanted to take the conversation before we finished up today. Everything we've been talking about is this concept that change requires a degree of self-permission and engagement with choice and engagement with novel choice of doing something you haven't done before, whether that's at a micro level or a macro level. In a fluid world where you're making so many choices, part of what I talk about in the book is sort of embedding that in your operating system so that you are, as I described earlier, a little bit more fluid and adaptive than, say, I was or my parents were, where they could remain more fixed in their understanding of how they behaved and operated and still succeed. In a world of nonstop disruption, personal change management is a 21st century survival skill. So it's like, how am I going to drive my own constant adaptation to a changing set of circumstances, which requires me to be a lot more switched on to what I think is allowed and what I am allowing myself to do. And given that we're almost out of time here, maybe this is just something for us to look at together. I would be really interested in hearing a little more from you guys about what you're seeing with your clients about dealing with the nonstop change. I mean, I know many of you have been working for many years and has the last decade, for instance, brought you new sets of circumstances or new challenges or opportunities, the other side with your clients? Are you seeing this played out with them? And has that, I say here, how might we adapt our coaching if we assume that this is only going to accelerate? But also maybe the question is, have you adapted, or how have you adapted or learned to help people? Maybe if we just started from sort of COVID onwards to people who I think feel like everything's moving around them in a way that maybe they don't feel equipped to keep up with or to stay out in front of, in a way. Yeah, do you have any thoughts about any of those questions and what you're seeing in your own workplace or your own practice?
I can't see myself, but I'm happy to share.
Okay.
Can you see me? I think for myself, I've been aware of helping people build resilience within themselves. And one of the foundations of that is mindfulness, cultivating mindfulness in the moment and holding on to their sense of self and their center, so to speak. And then also try to help people work with, instead of work-life balance, sort of integrating their experience of themselves in the world in a way of being that takes them with their own sense of self and their sense of their values, their guidelines, their principles into whatever circumstance they're in. So there's a kind of a mindful awareness, but the constant is a way of being which is mindful. I suppose that's the way I could put it.
No, thank you.
And it's not grand or big or spectacular. It's, in fact, very much along what you're suggesting. Small and solid and powerful within oneself.
Yeah, I think for me, when I talk about small steps, I I reference being in places that felt overwhelming to me and how I would bring my locus of control very tight. Like I actually felt a physical coming into myself the more that the circumstances around me felt out of my control. And I think I'm resonating with that as you're speaking, that there's that coming into self as a way of sort of steadying yourself amidst all of the whatever's buffeting you around you. Anybody else?
That's interesting. I sort of feel the tension between, on the one hand, getting a bit larger and reaching a bit further, sort of increasing service area for picking up useful bits and connecting to the world more on the one hand, and on the other hand, this idea of getting a bit smaller, which also resonated for me. You also talked about adapting continuously rather than sort of, you know, every now and then trying to make big change when things get critical. So that's I'm trying to figure out how to nicely integrate those two different aspects, because there is a sense that they are both valuable. And in the larger world, it seems that people are embracing sort of pulling in, building walls, becoming independent to deal with rapid change and uncertainty. But yeah, at the same time, it feels that there is value in that connection and building stronger webs that's more resilient.
Yeah, wow, beautiful. I love that idea of the greater surface area of our lives. I feel that same tension that you're describing, and it's almost this kind of ebbing and flowing. And I think a lot of people feel that. On the one hand, we're pulled out ever more, and we can know more and feel connected to more, and yet, you know, we're kind of coming into ourselves at the same time. I kind of experience it as a little bit of a teetering or a, you know, an ebb and a flow at times of how much I feel I want to be, to release myself more into one of those spaces or the other. But that's just me. But I really feel a lot of what you're describing is I recognize a lot of that. A last comment, as I see we're getting right on to 6 o'clock. Is there anything else that anyone wants to share now?
I just want to circle back to a comment that I think Julia made towards the beginning about too much permission. And I mean, we do live in a world where there are some significant narcissists who live with entitlement and I think too big of a sense of permission. And just to keep that in mind, because some of the people we're working with are facing that as well.
100%. And, you know, I think in many ways those people take advantage of the fact that other people don't feel allowed to always engage with them in the way that they should, or, you know, they kind of suck up the permission in the room, if you will. So I think in some ways, you know, a lot of us sit and suffer in the face of that and don't always allow ourselves to engage with it in a way. And I think some of this for me, obviously there will be excesses around anything, and I would hope that actually, you know, the more that some of us feel we can tap into our own voice and our own will, we can serve to kind of counterbalance some of those little, you know, vacuums of, or those concentrated permission spots in the world, and have more equitable and more fruitful engagements than perhaps what exists now. But yes, absolutely something to be aware of. Thank you so much. The time has just galloped by, and this has been a wonderful opportunity, obviously, for me. I've learned a lot with you, and from you in terms of the questions that you've asked and the ways that you've sort of made me think about things through different lenses. So I'm very grateful for that. And I, really admire and respect everything you guys are out in the world doing. So thank you for taking some of your time to share with me. And, thank you, for giving some of your best contributions to this conversation. I'm grateful, and I hope in some ways it'll continue to provide food for thought.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you so much. And all comments are coming in to say thank you for a wonderful conversation, provocative. Thank you for your time here. And I must say the 10 permissions they really do feel inspiring and encouraging. So I just love looking at the list and go, what can you do today, Cherise? And thank you everybody for your shares and the conversation. It was wonderful to have you here as always. And I will share the video recording and the slides and also a link or anything about your book, Jill. So look out for your emails for later in the week, and we'll see you at next month's session, I think on the 9th of September, but more will be shared about that.
Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.